In America, we love to brag about freedom, but that sometimes extends to the freedom to eat additives other countries won't even allow near their citizens. From hormone-boosted dairy to bread stiffened with chemicals also found in yoga mats, our shelves often read more like a chemistry set than a grocery store. Since 2021, new bans abroad and state-level measures at home have pushed more attention onto these ingredients. Even the FDA started revisiting food chemicals in 2024 and 2025. Today we're breaking down 33 American foods still banned overseas, why they're restricted, and how some companies are changing. And yes, the list starts bright. Mountain Dew banned glow-in-the-dark soda. Mountain Dew built its reputation on looking more like a science experiment than a soft drink. The luminous green bottles, the marketing promises of extreme energy, and the dare-like vibe all played into that image. But the real issue hiding behind the glow was brominated vegetable oil, or BVO, an additive that kept citrus flavors from separating, but carried a history that made regulators uneasy. BVO contains bromine, a chemical element also found in flame retardants. While that alone doesn't make it toxic, studies on brominated compounds have raised concerns about neurological effects and thyroid disruption in animals, leading regulators to question whether long-term exposure was safe for people. Japan banned BVO in the 1970s, and the European Union later did the same, leaving the United States as one of the few markets where it survived well into the 21st century. For years, soda makers used it freely in products like Mountain Dew and certain citrus-flavored Gatorades, but public pressure gradually pushed many companies to move away from it. As of July 2024, the FDA formally revoked authorization for BVO, citing safety concerns and aligning U.S. regulations with the international bans already in place. Still, the change hasn't been instant. Some U.S. shelves continue to carry cans and bottles with the old formula as production phases out, even though the recipe is reformulated abroad. A drink bought in Germany looks the same on the outside, but no longer contains the chemical that American regulators only recently decided to eliminate. Want to know why you can still find the old formulas in some U.S. cans? I'll explain why companies and regulators moved at different speeds. And this isn't the only example of America allowing additives others rejected years ago. The same pattern shows up in another basic staple many of us keep in the fridge every day. Milk with RBSD. Hormone boost nobody else wants. Milk became its own controversy when American regulators approved synthetic hormones for dairy cows back in 1993. The hormone, known as RBSD or RBGH, is a lab-made version of bovine somatotropin. Farmers inject it to stimulate higher milk yields without adding more cows or feed, which made it appealing as a cost-cutting tool in the 1990s. A USDA survey from 2014, however, showed that only about 10% of farms were still using it, reflecting how public opinion and market forces steadily turned against the practice. The scientific debate has always centered on what RBSD does to milk composition. Studies show milk from treated cows can have higher levels of IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. Some research has suggested a potential link between elevated IGF-1 and increased risks of cancers such as breast, prostate, and colorectal. While not every study has confirmed a direct cause and effect relationship, the possibility was enough for Europe and Canada to reject the hormone outright in the early 1990s. Their regulators concluded that avoiding potential risks was a safer public health bet than accepting cheaper production costs. Here in the US, the FDA has never reversed its approval, but consumer behavior tells a different story. Dairy products carrying RBSD-free or from cows not treated with artificial hormones labels have steadily gained traction. Major supermarket chains pushed suppliers to move away from RBSD, and today, hormone-free branding is visible across everything from gallon jugs of milk to national fast food cheese sourcing. Many Americans who still encounter it may not even realize that hormone-treated milk and hormone-free milk often sit side by side in the dairy section. And while milk became a battleground over hormones, the same tug-of-war between cost savings and consumer trust shows up in another product Americans grab off store shelves just as often, this time on the sweet side of the aisle: chocolate with PGPR emulsifiers. Chocolate offers another clear example of how American food makers cut costs in ways that raise eyebrows abroad. In the US, candy aisles are dominated by oversized bags sold at bargain prices, while European shelves emphasize richer cocoa content and fewer shortcuts. That contrast helps explain why US manufacturers frequently rely on an emulsifier called PGPR, while overseas markets tend to discourage or limit it. PGPR stands for polyglycerol polyresinolate. In chocolate, it acts as a blending aid, making it possible to use less cocoa butter while still producing a bar that appears smooth and glossy. For companies, it's an easy way to stretch expensive cocoa supplies further. To the casual shopper, the change isn't obvious. The chocolate still melts in your mouth, but critics argue it swaps a natural base ingredient for a processing additive that doesn't need to be there. In the United States, the FDA has approved PGPR for use in chocolate, and it commonly appears in mass-market candy. But health and consumer advocates have long questioned why an unnecessary emulsifier should replace cocoa butter at all. Lawsuits over the past decade highlighted complaints that labels often downplay how little cocoa is actually in some products. The argument is that PGPR itself is inherently toxic. It's that it represents another corner cut to maximize yield instead of flavor. European rules approach the issue differently. While PGPR isn't outright forbidden, regulators set stricter limits on emulsifiers and require clearer labeling, especially on foods marketed to children. In practice, that pushes major chocolate brands to sell higher cocoa versions abroad than they do in American grocery chains, reinforcing a cultural divide between snack food as a treat versus snack food as filler. And that divide is even more striking when you look beyond chocolate at another booming category, where the ingredient in question isn't a space-saving emulsifier, but a massive dose of stimulants. Energy drinks above caffeine limits. In the US, energy drinks have become the quick answer for anyone needing a burst of alertness. Students cramming through the night, workers pulling long shifts, and gamers stretching a marathon session often turn to cans that contain far more caffeine than a standard cup of coffee. Some varieties pack over 300 milligrams in one serving, roughly 3 or 4 strong coffees condensed into a single drink with a flashy label. Medical professionals warn that very high or repeated intake, especially among younger people, can increase the risk of heart problems, sleep disruption, and neurological issues. The concern rises when energy drinks also include extra stimulants like guarana and taurine, which can intensify the overall effect of the caffeine. Research continues to monitor how these combinations impact health over time, but warnings from doctors remain consistent. Moderation is critical. By 2025, several governments had moved to control the trend. Some countries limit caffeine amounts per serving, while others restrict sales to minors. The European Union requires clearer labeling and sets tighter caps that force brands to adjust their formulas overseas. Australia enforces similar limits with added warning labels. Certain Middle Eastern countries have banned sales entirely for anyone under 18. In practice, this means buying an energy drink abroad might involve showing proof of age, while in the US, teenagers can still grab one off the convenience store shelf without question. That divide creates two versions of popular brands: the international cans, reformulated to meet stricter standards, and the American ones, often double the strength and sold with minimal warnings. Later, we'll show a comparison that highlights just how different those cans can be. You might be surprised by which brands quietly scale back overseas. Energy isn't the only place where American products face a double standard, though. The same packaging that hides what's inside a tall can also shows up on familiar childhood snacks, where bright colors carry their own risks. Little Debbie Swiss rolls and colorful additives. For many Americans, Little Debbie Swiss rolls are less about nutrition and more about nostalgia. The shiny foil, the chocolate glaze, and that perfect spiral of cake and cream made them a lunchbox favorite. What most kids never knew, however, is that inside that cheerful wrapper are artificial dyes like Yellow 5 and Red 40, ingredients that fuel an ongoing debate about food safety worldwide. Yellow 5, also called tartrazine, has been criticized for decades. Research has linked it to hyperactivity and behavioral shifts in children, especially those already sensitive to dietary triggers. Red 40 has drawn similar concern, with studies suggesting associations with allergic reactions and neurological effects. The findings haven't been identical across every study, but the pattern was strong enough to prompt action overseas. Norway and Austria banned foods containing these dyes, while the European Union set strict rules. If a product includes certain dyes, the label must warn consumers that they may negatively affect kids' attention and activity. That warning often appears right on the packaging, leaving parents to decide if a colorful treat is worth the risk. By contrast, American shoppers see no similar disclosure. Swiss rolls line shelves as harmless after-school snacks without so much as a cautionary note, but cracks are beginning to show in that approach. In recent years, several U.S. states have introduced bills or regulatory reviews aimed at restricting synthetic dyes or requiring new labels. Advocacy groups continue to argue that parents deserve the same transparency already required in Europe. Want to avoid the additives but keep the snack? In many European markets, Swiss rolls are reformulated or at minimum come stamped with a warning. At home, the only hint is still the bright color itself. And this way of dressing up food with unnecessary chemicals isn't limited to desserts. It's just as common in the morning, especially in one of America's most recognizable breakfast staples. Fruit Loops with BHT flavor enhancers. Walk down any cereal aisle in the US and it's impossible to miss Fruit Loops. The bright reds, greens, and purples practically glow under the lights, promising fruit flavor even though the box doesn't contain actual fruit. Beyond the sugar and artificial dyes, there's another small detail on the label, BHT or butylated hydroxytoluene. It isn't there for taste or color, but as a preservative to keep the cereal from going stale and lengthen its shelf life. BHT has long been controversial. Laboratory research has raised concerns about potential carcinogenic effects in animals, and while findings vary, the possibility has been enough for regulators abroad to act cautiously. BHT and its chemical cousin BHA are restricted in several countries, including Japan and throughout the European Union, for nations that set tighter food safety standards. The simplest solution was to block products relying heavily on these additives or require reformulated recipes. The result is clear on store shelves overseas. A box of Fruit Loops sold in Europe looks identical on the outside, but may use different preservation methods and avoid certain synthetic dyes altogether. In contrast, the American version still carries the line BHT for freshness, and most consumers wouldn't know their breakfast looks different than what families are eating across the Atlantic. The product identity remains the same, but the reliance on chemical preservatives marks a divide between two approaches to food regulation. American buyers rarely see this difference spelled out on packaging. It's simply accepted as part of what's in the box. And while cereals keep their long life on U.S. shelves thanks to chemistry, another morning, favorite manages to stay just as common while, depending on additives that international health organizations have already declared unsafe. Coffee Mate Creamer and artificial fats. For many coffee drinkers, Coffee Mate Creamer is as common on the breakfast table as the mug itself. The bottles line grocery aisles in dozens of flavors, and those single-serve tubs show up in hotels and office kitchens everywhere. What's less obvious is that, for years, many versions of Coffee Mate were built around hydrogenated oils, ingredients that once made them creamier, but also put them in the middle of debates about artificial fats. Hydrogenated oils are the main source of artificial trans fats, which researchers link to higher cholesterol, arterial buildup, and greater risk of heart disease. Unlike some food additives still under study, trans fats came under unusually strong global criticism. In 2015, the US FDA announced a policy to remove partially hydrogenated oils, fuzz, from foods, effectively banning their use after a phase-out period. Even before that, Denmark and a handful of other countries had set strict limits, making them early leaders in eliminating trans fats from processed foods. By 2023, the World Health Organization took an even firmer stance, declaring them unsafe at any level. That doesn't mean every Coffee Mate bottle on shelves today is identical. Over time, Nestlé reformulated many versions to meet the FDA's phase-out rules and international laws. But historically, hydrogenated oils were a signature part of their creamers, which is one reason some countries required reformulated recipes before import. For consumers, the confusing part is that older lots and some specialty products may still reflect the older formulations, depending on where you shop. The main takeaway: checking labels matters more than assuming the brand as a whole has changed. We'll point out specific examples and what to look for on packaging in the end cards. And while creamers highlight America's complicated relationship with artificial fats, some of the same preservative debates show up in another beloved pantry item that's tied closely to major holiday meals: stove-top stuffing with preservatives. For many Americans, stove-top stuffing has been a dependable shortcut for holiday meals. Instead of drying bread and chopping vegetables, you just open a box, add hot water, and end up with a ready-made side that tastes close enough to homemade. Its long shelf life and big batch convenience are exactly what made it a pantry staple for decades. But on the back of the box, the ingredient list points to a detail that other countries have flagged: preservatives like BHA and BHT. These additives, short for butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene, act as synthetic antioxidants, keeping fats from spoiling and giving packaged foods a longer life in storage. That means stuffing can sit in the pantry for weeks without losing flavor or texture, which works well for shoppers who stock up ahead of the season. The downside is that studies in animals have raised concerns about their potential carcinogenic effects, and that uncertainty has shaped how different countries regulate them. BHA and BHT have been restricted or banned in several regions, including the European Union, Japan, and parts of the United Kingdom. Internationally, some brands reformulate their recipes with alternatives such as natural oils or vitamin E and feature them with clean label marketing. In contrast, the US still allows the additives, though in 2025 the FDA has placed both on its active review list for possible regulatory changes. Spoiler: many American companies already sell reformulated versions overseas. Sometimes the very same brand you see in US stores has a cleaner ingredient list abroad. Yet in American supermarkets, Stovetop still carries BHA and BHT into dining rooms every Thanksgiving. And preservatives aren't the only additives carving out two versions of the same familiar food. Frozen desserts come with their own hidden ingredient, one that looks harmless at first but has sparked new concern after recent studies: Drumstick ice cream and Carrageenan. Nothing captures summer snacking in the US like a drumstick cone, the chocolate-dipped top, the peanuts sprinkled over, and that hidden chunk of chocolate at the bottom of the waffle cone. It feels like a reward pulled straight from the freezer. But alongside the nostalgia sits an ingredient that many regulators overseas treat much more carefully: Carrageenan. Carrageenan comes from red seaweed and has been used for decades as a stabilizer, keeping ice cream creamy and preventing separation during storage. On paper, it looks like a simple plant-based solution. Yet studies over the years have linked Carrageenan to intestinal inflammation in animal research and certain lab experiments on human cells. While not all findings translate directly to human health, the uncertainty around digestive impacts has fueled calls for tighter rules, especially in foods intended for vulnerable groups. That caution is reflected in international regulations. The European Union restricts the use of Carrageenan in infant formula, citing concerns that developing digestive systems may be more at risk. Other countries have also placed limits on how and where Carrageenan can be used in food. By contrast, the US still allows it widely, and consumers will find it not just in drumsticks, but also in yogurt, creamers, and many other dairy-based desserts. So when Americans unwrap a drumstick cone on a hot afternoon, the ingredient list quietly includes Carrageenan, an additive some countries deliberately avoid in certain foods. Later in the video, we'll compare ingredient labels side by side so you'll know what to look for if you want to spot Carrageenan-free options. And Carrageenan is only one example of an additive that shapes how foods are marketed at home versus abroad. In other products, the controversy centers less on stabilizers and more on the very colors that make them look appealing in the first place. Skittles and artificial colors. Taste the rainbow may be one of the most recognizable slogans in American advertising, but the candy behind it relies on additives that have been under international scrutiny for years. Skittles get their bold hues from synthetic dyes like Yellow 5, Yellow 6, and Red 40. In the United States, those dyes remain broadly approved for use in candies, cereals, and drinks. In Europe, however, products containing these colors face tighter oversight. The European Union restricts certain dyes in infant foods and requires warning labels when they appear in snacks for older children. A stark difference from the US, where no such label is required. Medical researchers have questioned how these dyes might affect sensitive populations. Yellow 5 has been associated with allergic reactions, while Yellow 6 and Red 40 have drawn scrutiny for possible links to hyperactivity and attention issues. These concerns planted the seeds for reform, but in the early 2020s, dyes were no longer the only part of the Skittles recipe making headline. Titanium dioxide, used to make colors appear sharper and more uniform, set off a larger debate. In 2021, the European Food Safety Authority flagged genotoxicity concerns tied to titanium dioxide, citing evidence from rodent studies and cell experiments. By 2022, the European Commission banned titanium dioxide in foods altogether, forcing candy makers to reformulate if they wanted to keep selling across the EU. Some manufacturers moved even faster, removing it from recipes ahead of the mandate. Meanwhile, US regulators held a different line. The FDA continued to classify titanium dioxide as safe in small amounts, but by 2024 had accelerated reviews in response to mounting pressure. At the state level, places like California began weighing their own restrictions. If you want to avoid TO2 at home, checking labels is the only reliable option. We'll show clear examples later. This split leaves American candy aisles stacked with treats that carry additives their overseas counterparts have already eliminated. And it isn't limited to sugary brands with rainbow packaging. It also extends to everyday snacks that market themselves as the sensible choice. Wheat Thins, preserved with BHT. Wheat Thins are often marketed as the responsible choice in the snack aisle, the lighter option compared to cookies or chips. Yet the recipe includes an additive that has drawn scrutiny for years, BHT or butylated hydroxytoluene. This synthetic antioxidant is added to keep the crackers crisp by slowing down oxidation, ensuring they taste the same months after packaging. For manufacturers, it's an efficient way to extend shelf life. For consumers, it means the box in the back of the pantry doesn't go stale. The controversy comes from how different countries approach BHT's long-term effects. Researchers have debated its safety for decades, with animal studies raising questions about whether it could act as a potential carcinogen. While evidence in humans remains inconclusive, regulators abroad decided it wasn't a risk worth taking. Japan restricts the use of BHT in packaged foods, and several European markets enforce similar limits or ban it outright in certain products. Their reasoning is straightforward. If there are safer alternatives, companies should use them. That's why boxes of Wheat Thins sold in Europe don't contain BHT at all. Instead, they rely on natural preservatives such as oils or vitamin-based additives, allowing them to meet local standards without changing the texture or taste. To shoppers, the packaging and branding still highlight wholesome ingredients, but the ingredient list is notably leaner than what you'll find in American stores. Back in the US, the FDA still permits BHT, though it remains under post-market review. Most American buyers are unlikely to notice that their better-for-you snack contains a preservative unavailable in some international versions. It's the same product name, but with two very different approaches to what's inside. And this divide isn't limited to crackers. Many drinks also rely on artificial additives, including some of the most recognizable bottles tied to sports and hydration. Gatorade and neon sports drinks. Picture the classic Gatorade advert. Exhausted athletes dripping with sweat, collapsing after a hard game, then twisting open a cap and gulping down neon liquid as if it's the key to recovery. That trademark glow doesn't come from natural ingredients. It's powered by synthetic dyes like Yellow 5 and Yellow 6, which provide the bright green and orange tones that have become tied to Gatorade's identity. The purpose is simple. Take a clear base and make it look like concentrated energy in a bottle. But those colors have sparked debate for decades. Both Yellow 5 and Yellow 6 have been studied for possible links to hyperactivity and attention issues in children. While evidence is not conclusive across every study, the findings have raised concerns among doctors, parents, and advocacy groups. In Europe, regulators took measurable steps years ago. Instead of banning the dyes outright, the European Union required warning labels on products targeted to children, with explicit language that synthetic colors may affect behavior or activity. For parents shopping in EU grocery stores, this means choosing a bottle is also choosing whether to accept that risk. That regulatory difference shapes what the drink looks like abroad. In many European markets, Gatorade is reformulated with plant-derived colorings. The flavors remain familiar, but the drinks look more muted, lacking the fluorescent punch found in the American versions. By contrast, in the United States, the focus remains squarely on performance claims like hydrates better than water or replaces electrolytes, with no mention of why the liquid glows so brightly. It's a pattern that leaves U.S. shelves stocked with products defined by color additives, while consumers overseas often see toned-down formulas. And while Gatorade bottles stand out for their neon hues, they're not the only everyday snack where artificial colors remain central to the recipe. Pop-Tarts and bright synthetic dyes. Pop-Tarts may be one of the most recognizable breakfast shortcuts in American kitchens. Drop one in the toaster, and within minutes you've got a frosted pastry with a sugary filling that feels more like dessert than breakfast. But behind the colorful icing is a set of synthetic dyes that continues to fuel debate across global food regulators. In the US, most Pop-Tarts rely on artificial colors including Yellow 5, Yellow 6, and Red 40. These dyes serve no flavoring purpose. They exist purely to give the frosting and fillings their bright, uniform colors. While the FDA still allows their use, other health authorities reach different conclusions. Studies have raised concerns about how synthetic dyes may affect children's attention and behavior, prompting closer scrutiny. Some European Union countries require warning labels when these dyes appear in foods marketed to children, and nations like Norway and Austria restrict products containing them altogether. That difference has a clear impact on what ends up on store shelves. Pop-Tarts sold in the EU are often reformulated with alternatives like paprika extract, annatto, or beet juice for coloring. These pastries still look familiar, but the colors are noticeably muted compared to their American counterparts. For regulators, the switch matters less for appearance and more for reducing exposure to additives tied to behavioral or allergy risks. Later in this video, we'll show a direct comparison of US and EU ingredient lists for the same flavor, so you can see how the recipes shift. In the United States, consumer groups continue to petition Kellogg's to move away from synthetic dyes, pointing to studies that link some of them to cellular-level DNA damage. Yet, despite mounting pressure, the U.S. product lines remain packed with bright frostings and fillings. Abroad, the same snack carries fewer additives. Here at home, they remain the standard. As we'll see, that reliance on chemical preservation is not limited to sweet breakfasts. It's just as common in savory staples found on the weekend breakfast table. Farmer John's sausages and BHT preservation. For many American households, pork sausage on a weekend morning is as familiar as the coffee pot. Farmer John breakfast sausages are just one example of how processed meats in the U.S. rely on additives to keep products consistent and long-lasting. The ingredient list doesn't just include pork and seasoning. It also often contains BHT, or butylated hydroxytoluene. BHT is a synthetic antioxidant that helps prevent fats from spoiling, which makes sense in foods where pork fat is central. By slowing down oxidation, BHT allows sausages to stay fresh well beyond when they normally would. From a manufacturing perspective, it's a practical solution. Shoppers can buy a pack and store it without worrying about quick expiration. But concerns surrounding BHT aren't new. Animal studies have suggested it could act as a possible carcinogen. And while results in humans remain uncertain, that evidence has been enough for regulators in several countries to restrict or remove the additive. The European Union has limited where BHT can be used in food, preferring it not appear in products like sausages at all. Japan enforces similarly tight rules, and other markets have pressured companies to reformulate with safer alternatives. As a result, many multinational food brands sell cleaner recipes abroad while keeping the preservative in American versions. This creates a split between how familiar products look domestically compared to overseas. The FDA continues to allow BHT, but it is now under post-market review. For consumers who want to avoid it altogether, the best approach is simple: check packaging. If you care about what's actually in your breakfast sausage, watch for BHT or BHA on the label, or opt for brands that clearly advertise no BHT added. And sausages aren't the only breakfast food where chemical additives make a quiet appearance. Even the cereal bowl, with its bright, candy-colored marshmallows, tells a similar story. Lucky Charms, Magical colors with warning labels. For many American children, breakfast often meant a bowl of Lucky Charms filled with brightly colored marshmallows and oat pieces, marketed with the promise of being magically delicious. Parents bought into the fun, and it became a household staple. But what looked like simple morning nostalgia came with synthetic dyes, often yellow 5, yellow 6, and red 40, that carry more regulatory weight overseas than they do in the US. These synthetic colors have been studied for decades, and while the research hasn't delivered absolute proof of harm, it has raised enough questions to spark ongoing debate. Some studies point to possible links between artificial dyes and hyperactivity or attention issues in children. Others have raised questions about long-term DNA effects. The results aren't identical across studies, but the collective pattern has been enough for regulators abroad to err on the side of caution. In the European Union, cereals containing these dyes must display a specific warning label alerting parents that the ingredients may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. That warning shows up directly on packaging, meaning shoppers overseas are confronted with the risk before pouring a bowl. Norway and Austria have gone further, restricting or barring products with these dyes altogether. Compare this to the United States, where Lucky Charms boxes remain filled with rainbows, leprechaun mascots, and whole grain stamps, but say nothing about the possible behavioral concerns tied to the bright marshmallow color. This creates a striking contrast. The same cereal carries warnings abroad, but sails through US supermarket aisles as a harmless treat. Bet you can't guess which major cereal brands already dropped these dyes in some American versions. We'll name a few later on. And colorful marshmallows aren't the only everyday food with labels that look very different depending on where you buy them. Even savory party favorites carry the same divide. Tostitos salsa con queso dip. Tostitos salsa con queso dip is one of those staples you'll find on American party tables year-round. Sold in jars that can sit on the pantry shelf for months, it delivers the look and texture of melted cheese without grating or shredding a single block. Heat it in the microwave, and the result is that familiar glowing orange dip that seems perfectly designed for chips. But the vivid color owes less to dairy and more to synthetic additives that keep it looking cheesy, even after long storing. The fluorescent orange shade is created with artificial colorants, such as yellow 5 and yellow 6. These dyes don't come from natural cheese pigments. They're added to give a uniform, intense tone and create the perception of freshness. While regulators in the US allow their use across countless products, other regions take a stricter view. Research has raised concerns about possible links to hyperactivity in children and potential DNA damage in lab study. As a result, some countries decided the risks weren't worth leaving to chance. Norway and Austria restrict or ban food products that contain these dyes, while the broader European Union requires warning labels on packages that use them. That rule means that jars of shelf-stable queso sold in Europe either carry cautionary language or are reformulated with natural colorings such as paprika or annatto instead. For consumers, the difference is clear. Queso abroad looks more like real cheese, while in America it keeps the same neon brightness you never see in a homemade version. Later, we'll share a quick tip on how to spot queso that uses natural coloring instead. This example highlights how something as simple as color can reveal a global divide in food standards. And color is only part of the story. Some of the most popular American snacks rely on hidden fats that other nations have already moved to eliminate. Ritz crackers and hidden trans fats. Ritz crackers are sold as the dependable snack with a buttery crunch, equally at home on a party tray or straight from the box. But the familiar red packaging has also carried an ingredient that regulators abroad have treated with caution: partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil. This oil was once common in American processed foods and served as a source of trans fats, one of the most criticized ingredients in modern nutrition. For food companies, trans fats were once a breakthrough. They gave Ritz crackers the same texture and taste every time, while also prolonging shelf life. Unfortunately, those same properties that made them ideal for manufacturing also made them damaging in the body. Studies consistently linked industrial trans fats to higher LDL cholesterol, arterial buildup, and increased rates of heart disease. Over time, the medical consensus grew unusually clear compared to other nutrients. Avoiding artificial trans fats altogether was the safest recommendation. That clarity reshaped regulations worldwide. The World Health Organization called for a global elimination of industrial trans fats, and many countries responded with outright bans. As a result, Ritz crackers sold in European markets no longer use partially hydrogenated oils, relying instead on other fats considered safer. Shoppers there still find Ritz on store shelves, but the recipes have been reformulated to fit regional laws. In the US, however, the story has been slower to change. Ritz and similar snacks historically contained partially hydrogenated oils well into the FDA's phase-out period, which began in 2015. While many products have since been reformulated, Americans still need to check ingredient lists, since labeling varies depending on when and where the box was produced. This split underscores how the same familiar brand can carry different formulations across borders. And just as crackers illustrate how ingredients can diverge from one country to another, some US soft drinks follow a similar path, especially those that gained their distinct look with an additive that regulators overseas banned years ago: Fresca and brominated vegetable oil. Fresca built its reputation as the grown-up soda. Unlike bright neon soft drinks or sugar-heavy orange sodas, it was marketed as crisp, no-calorie, and citrusy, a lighter option for people who wanted flavor without the guilt. For decades, it showed up at backyard gatherings and potlucks as the subtler alternative to classic sodas. But for much of its history, that refreshing image was tied to an ingredient that raised red flags abroad: brominated vegetable oil, better known as BVO. BVO was originally added to citrus sodas like Fresca to stabilize flavor oils. Without it, lemon and grapefruit extracts tended to separate and collect at the top. The additive kept drinks uniform, but it brought concerns with it as well. BVO contains bromine, and animal studies suggested possible impacts on memory, thyroid function, and skin health. While the science was not definitive, regulators and health groups questioned whether a flame-retardant element belonged anywhere in a beverage. Other countries acted years earlier. Japan banned the use of BVO in the 1970s, and the European Union followed with its own restrictions, forcing soda makers to reformulate for those markets. For a long time, the United States continued to allow BVO, and Fresca retained its original recipe domestically, even while international versions quietly dropped the additive. The tide finally shifted in recent years. PepsiCo had already phased BVO out of many products under consumer pressure, and by July 2024, the FDA formally revoked authorization for it in all foods. This decision aligned American policy with international bans, though it came decades later. You'll find that international versions of citrus sodas were reformulated years in advance. More on that in the wrap-up. Even with additives like BVO being phased out, U.S. grocery shelves still carry plenty of everyday products built on other controversial ingredients, especially the kind of convenience foods families rely on every weekend morning: Pillsbury biscuits and trans fat. Few packaged foods are as instantly recognizable as the blue can of Pillsbury biscuits. The appeal is built into the ritual itself. Pop the cardboard tube, pull out the dough, and within minutes you've got a tray of warm, golden biscuits ready for the table. For many families, they've been part of Sunday breakfasts and holiday spreads for generations. What isn't as obvious is how that convenience was achieved. Historically, these biscuits relied on partially hydrogenated oil. Partially hydrogenated oils worked as a stabilizing fat in canned dough. They ensured the texture stayed soft, the dough rose evenly, and the product held up on store shelves for months. The problem is that these oils are the primary source of artificial trans fats, an ingredient widely recognized as harmful. Decades of research showed trans fats raise bad LDL cholesterol, lower good HDL cholesterol, and contribute to higher risks of heart disease. Unlike other controversial additives, trans fats have been one area where global health experts reached rare consensus. Regulators responded decisively. In 2015, the FDA moved to eliminate partially hydrogenated oils from the U.S. food supply, and that phase-out was finalized in 2018. The World Health Organization pressed countries worldwide to do the same, urging a total removal of industrial trans fats from food by 2023. Many nations already banned them outright, forcing companies to reformulate with alternatives like palm or canola oil. Today, in most international markets, canned biscuits are still available, but without the trans fats. In the US, brands like Pillsbury have introduced reformulated versions, but lingering variations mean ingredient labels can differ by product and region. For shoppers who want to be certain, the safest approach is to check packaging for both zero-G trans fat and confirmation that no hydrogenated oils are listed. Next, we'll turn to a very different category of processed food, one that glows bright orange and shows how artificial coloring remains a dividing line between American shelves and foreign ones. Sunkist soda with artificial colors. Sunkist soda has long been sold as liquid sunshine, its iconic orange glow making it stand out in vending machines, gas stations, and picnic coolers. The look is part of its appeal, but that striking citrus hue doesn't come from oranges alone. It's created with synthetic dyes, which give the drink a fluorescent brightness that's as much about appearance as flavor. In the United States, these colors are treated as routine additives. They're what makes Sunkist gleam under store lighting, creating the impression of a fruit-forward soda. But regulators abroad take a more cautious approach. Concerns about artificial dyes have centered on possible links to hyperactivity and attention problems in children. While the science is still debated, officials in Europe judged that families deserve transparency. The EU requires warning labels for food and drinks containing certain dyes, particularly those sold to children, and many products end up reformulated to avoid the label altogether. In some EU markets, citrus sodas instead use natural colorants like paprika or carrot extract. Here in the US, the artificial glow remains common. That means the same brand can look different depending on the shelf you're shopping from. Abroad, citrus sodas often appear paler, closer to real fruit juice, while American versions keep their sharper neon coloring. It's a subtle shift that signals a bigger divide over whether appearance or potential risk carries more weight. Later, we'll also compare how sweeteners differ, where some markets use sugar while US sodas rely heavily on corn syrup. This contrast between ingredient lists isn't limited to drinks. Packaged baking mixes, another grocery staple tied to family gatherings, often show the same split, with US versions still relying on additives other countries have pushed out. Betty Crocker fudge brownie mix and trans fats. In American kitchens, few desserts are as recognizable as a box of Betty Crocker fudge brownie mix. Add a couple of pantry staples, bake for under an hour, and the result is a pan of warm brownies that feels like a guaranteed win for family desserts. But what often goes unnoticed on the back label is an ingredient that shaped how these mixes stayed on shelves for so long: partially hydrogenated oil. These oils were once a quiet workhorse of processed baking. They stabilized fats, kept texture consistent, and extended the shelf life of products that might otherwise spoil quickly. The drawback was chemical inevitability. Partially hydrogenated oils create trans fats. Over decades, evidence mounted linking industrial trans fats to elevated cholesterol, heart disease, and significant increases in cardiovascular risk. Unlike other nutrients, health organizations around the world reached a clear position. There is no safe level of artificial trans fat. That consensus drove change. Europe, Canada, and dozens of other jurisdictions moved to restrict or ban industrial trans fats outright. Manufacturers reformulated, replacing hydrogenated oils with alternatives to achieve the same fudgy texture. A box of brownie mix abroad may look identical on the outside, but the ingredients inside no longer rely on fats that global regulators moved against. The World Health Organization added trans fats to its global elimination agenda, reinforcing the idea that they have no place in modern food system. In the US, versions of Betty Crocker mixes historically included partially hydrogenated oils well into the FDA's phase-out rule in 2015, finalized by 2018. Many recipes have since been updated, but ingredient lists can still vary by product line or where the box was sourced. For American shoppers, the best way to be certain is to scan the label carefully for hydrogenated in the fat sources. And baked mixes are only one category where hidden preservatives and additives appear. Even the pie crusts pulled out for holiday gatherings reveal the same divide in approach between convenience and chemical caution. Pillsbury pie crust with BHA and BHT. Pre-made pie crusts are among the most common shortcuts in American kitchens, especially during the holidays. Pillsbury's refrigerated version is one of the most popular, ready to unroll and fill without the work of mixing, rolling, and chilling dough by hand. While it's marketed as a simple time saver, the label tells a more complicated story. Alongside flour and fat, it often contains two additives that have faced international scrutiny: BHA and BHT. BHA, or butylated hydroxyanisole, and BHT, or butylated hydroxytoluene, are synthetic antioxidants added to prevent fats from going rancid. Their presence allows products like pie crusts to stay stable for weeks in the fridge, which is convenient for both companies and shoppers. But studies in animals have raised concerns that these preservatives may act as possible carcinogens and could have endocrine-disrupting effects, prompting regulators to question their long-term role in food. While evidence in humans remains less certain, that regulatory caution has already shaped policies abroad. Several jurisdictions restrict their use outright. The European Union has imposed tighter rules on when and how BHA and BHT can appear, while Japan has long limited them in food. These moves have forced companies to produce cleaner formulations for export markets, often relying on natural preservatives like tocopherols, vitamin E, instead. In Europe, for example, families can pick up packaged pie crusts that serve the same function in the oven, but without synthetic additive. In the United States, Pillsbury products remain widely available, with BHA and BHT still listed among the ingredients. The FDA continues to allow their use, but both compounds are now subject to ongoing review. For American consumers who want to avoid them, the simple step is to look for no BHA/BHT labels, which are increasingly used by smaller and specialty brands. And while preservatives in pie crusts highlight one side of the debate, some of the brightest colors in American desserts point to another. Where even a childhood treat owes its look to additives, other regulators treat far more cautiously. Raspberry Jell-O with Red 40. Raspberry Jell-O has been a fixture at school lunches, birthday parties, and backyard cookouts for decades. The wobbly red cubes look harmless, even playful, but what gives them their vibrant color isn't raspberries at all, it's Red 40. Yes, the color more than the fruit drives the look. Check labels if that matters to you. Red 40, also known as Allura Red, is one of the most widely used synthetic dyes in the United States. It appears in everything from cereal to soda, but Jell-O is perhaps the most iconic showcase because the color defines the dessert. The concern isn't just cosmetic. Studies have raised possible links between Red 40 and hyperactivity or attention issues in children, as well as reports of allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. While not every study reaches the same conclusion, the consistency of caution has been strong enough to push regulators outside the US to act. In Europe, for example, Red 40 doesn't have the same free pass it enjoys in America. The dye is restricted, and when it does appear in food, the EU often requires clear warning labels stating that it may affect activity and attention in children. Parents buying gelatin mixes abroad see the issue flagged right on the box. Some markets go further, reformulating recipes to use natural coloring agents like beetroot extract instead. That means raspberry gelatin sold in European supermarkets has a more muted appearance, closer to the color raspberries actually produce, without the fluorescent punch US shoppers have grown used to. Here at home, though, Jell-O hasn't budged. The boxes continue to promise the same candy red shade that generations grew up eating, even as other regions decide transparency or reformulation is the safer path. And while artificial colors spark one kind of debate, the 1990s saw another food additive dominate headlines, this time not for brightness, but for how it promised to take fat out of America's favorite snacks. Doritos Light and Olestra. Doritos Light entered the snack aisle during the height of the fat-free craze in the 1990s, promising the same bold flavors as regular chips without the calories. The ingredient making that possible was Olestra, marketed under the name Olean. On paper, it seemed like a breakthrough. Olestra wasn't absorbed by the body, which meant you could eat chips without taking in the fat. For a country leaning toward fad diets, it looked like an easy shortcut. The problem was how it behaved once people started eating it. Instead of acting like a harmless substitute, Olestra caused gastrointestinal side effects for many consumers. Reports of cramps, bloating, and digestive distress became widespread, and the most notorious symptom, labeled anal leakage, quickly turned into a public relations nightmare. What began as a miracle ingredient ended up as a punchline, and sales never fully recovered. Health authorities outside the United States viewed Olestra with greater caution from the start. Canada banned foods containing it, as did the United Kingdom and other European nations, citing more than just consumer complaints. Regulators pointed out that Olestra could interfere with the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like D, E, and K, which raised long-term nutritional concerns. To them, the modest calorie savings didn't outweigh the possible losses in essential nutrients. By the early 2000s, Olestra-based snacks had largely disappeared from mainstream U.S. shelves as well. While a few specialty products lingered on, the combination of public backlash, international bans, and dwindling demand sealed its decline. Today, Doritos Light is remembered as one of the most infamous examples of how fast food innovation can backfire. It illustrates how ingredients developed for cost or convenience can raise bigger questions once regulators and consumers take a closer look. An issue that shows up just as clearly in everyday bread sold in American fast food chains. Arby's sourdough bread and yoga matte chemicals. If you've ever ordered a sourdough sandwich at Arby's, you've seen how the bread holds its shape and texture on the griddle. It looks rustic enough with a golden crust and soft crumb, but what keeps it consistent isn't just flour and yeast. Mixed into the dough is azodicarbonamide, shortened to ADA. In baking, ADA works as a bleaching agent and a dough conditioner, helping dough rise evenly and stay pliable during storage and cooking. The catch is that ADA isn't only used in food. It also appears in industrial products like foam mats and shoe soles, where it provides elasticity and strength. That overlap is why it's earned the nickname, the yoga mat chemical. The comparison raises eyebrows not because it's toxic on contact, but because of how ADA breaks down. Heat or processing can generate compounds like semicarbazide and urethane, which have raised safety concerns in lab study. Occupational exposure has also linked ADA dust to respiratory issues, leading regulators abroad to take a more restrictive stance. The United States still approves ADA at limited levels, though the FDA has put it under review and several states are considering tighter rules. Meanwhile, the European Union and Australia banned it from food altogether, citing the breakdown chemicals and long-term concerns. Public pressure in the US has also led many bakeries and fast food chains to quietly phase it out, though some products, including Arby's sourdough, still listed among their ingredients. For consumers, it creates split menus. A sourdough sandwich in Europe uses a different recipe than the same one bought in an American drive-thru. Want to know which bakeries still use ADA? We'll highlight simple label checks you can make later. And while figuring out what goes into bread is one challenge, other foods bring up even broader questions, especially when the ingredient at issue is part of the plant itself. Genetically engineered papaya. On the islands of Hawaii, papaya is more than just a fruit, it's an essential crop. In the 1990s, local farmers faced devastation from the ring spot virus, which threatened to wipe out orchards entirely. Scientists developed a technological fix, genetically engineered papaya varieties designed to resist the disease. The approach worked. Yields recovered, farming communities stabilized, and this new variety quickly became the dominant type grown in Hawaii, supplying most of the papaya eaten in the United States. For American consumers, the fruit was presented as a story of agricultural innovation, and over time, genetically engineered papaya became the standard supply on grocery shelves. Labeling in the US has been limited. So many shoppers aren't even aware that the diced fruit in their smoothie or fruit salad comes from a genetically modified plant. In the US, GMO papaya is so common that it often goes unnoticed unless you look for it on packaging. If you do see GMO papaya listed, know that it reflects what's typical here but not abroad. In contrast, those same genetically engineered papayas never secured approval in Europe. The European Union enforces strict rules on genetically modified foods, regulating many GMOs under a precautionary framework. Papaya varieties developed in Hawaii fall under those restrictions, meaning they are not accepted in several European markets. Shoppers there find only conventional papayas, and any food containing genetically modified ingredients must be clearly labeled. Some countries, like Austria and France, have taken especially firm stances, applying even stricter measures around GMOs in general. The result is a sharp contrast. In the US, virus-resistant papayas are standard fare. In Europe, they represent crops kept out of the food chain. That divide over biotechnology reflects a broader question that comes up again and again. What counts as an acceptable substitute in our food supply, especially when it sneaks into everyday items we eat without a second thought? High fructose corn syrup everywhere. High fructose corn syrup is one of the most common sweeteners in the American food supply. It appears in sodas, breads, condiments, cereals, and even in products that don't taste particularly sweet. A trip through any U.S. supermarket reveals just how ingrained it has become. The reason is cost. Corn is one of the most heavily subsidized crops in the country, which makes corn syrup consistently cheaper than cane sugar. For food companies, the choice is simple. It delivers sweetness at a fraction of the price. For consumers, the trade-off is more complicated. Nutrition researchers don't single out high fructose corn syrup as the only culprit, but they do associate regular consumption of sugary, ultra-processed foods, including those sweetened with HFCS, with obesity, diabetes, and metabolic disease. The issue isn't just what the sweetener is, but how often it shows up and in how many products. With decades of cheap HFCS driving down costs of sodas and snacks, Americans have had more access to inexpensive calories than most other parts of the world. Those patterns show up in long-term health statistics, fueling public debate about whether the price savings were really worth it. Outside the United States, the story looks different. The European Union has long capped imports of HFCS and puts economic policy behind sugar alternatives like cane or beet sugar. It's not an outright ban, but the quotas and pricing rules keep HFCS from flooding European markets the way it did in the US. As a result, many of the same drinks Americans know are sweetened with beet or cane sugar in Europe, while here they are still loaded with corn syrup. We'll show how the same soda often uses different sweeteners, depending on where it's sold. And while sugar and syrups highlight differences in what goes into processed foods, protein sources tell a similar story, where even the color of a main dish can depend on additives. Farm-raised salmon with artificial coloring. For many Americans, salmon is a go-to dinner centerpiece, grilled fillets, oven-baked portions, or even salmon bowls. The recognizable pink-orange color is part of why it feels appealing on the plate. What's less widely understood is that farm-raised salmon doesn't develop that color naturally. Without intervention, the flesh of farmed fish would appear closer to gray. To meet consumer expectations, farms add pigments such as astaxanthin into feed pellets, ensuring the fillets take on the shade people expect to see. In the wild, salmon pick up their color by eating krill and shrimp, which are rich in carotenoid compounds. But because farmed fish don't have access to that diet, farmers recreate the effect. Astaxanthin in feed can be derived either from natural sources like microalgae or made synthetically. Regardless of form, the process isn't about boosting nutrition, it's about delivering a consistent appearance. In U.S. grocery stores, this practice is standard, because salmon that looks pale or gray would almost certainly fail to sell. International regulators have approached farmed salmon differently, and not only because of feed additives. Australia and New Zealand, for example, have imposed tighter restrictions on farmed salmon imports, citing concerns about contaminants, antibiotic use, and environmental impacts tied to intensive farming. For these countries, the color issue is just one part of a broader skepticism about the industrial model of raising salmon. Many consumers in those markets prefer wild-caught salmon, where the pink flesh occurs naturally. So while a fillet in the United States is often shaped by what was mixed into feed, the same product abroad might be sourced from wild fisheries instead. Wild-caught versus farm-raised isn't only about color. It also reflects which farming practices and additives regulators are willing to allow. Concerns like these shape food policies beyond seafood as well. Even staple proteins are handled differently depending on the country, with processing practices sparking just as much debate. Chlorine-washed chicken. In the United States, one of the most debated poultry practices is chlorine washing. Processing plants handle thousands of birds per hour, and that pace comes with a high risk of contamination from bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli. To keep those pathogens under control, the industry relies on antimicrobial rinses, most commonly chlorine dioxide. After slaughter, carcasses are dunked or sprayed in these solutions before packaging. For American regulators, it's a cost-effective way to reduce risk without overhauling farming conditions or facility design. This method, though, is exactly why chlorinated chicken remains one of the most disputed exports the U.S. could offer. European regulators banned the practice in the 1990s, but their objection was not that trace chlorine residues were acutely toxic for consumers. Instead, they viewed chemical washes as a band-aid over a system that allows contamination to develop earlier in production. The EU's food policy follows a farm-to-fork model, emphasizing preventive hygiene at every stage. To them, a safer system is one where healthier birds and cleaner slaughterhouses make chlorine baths unnecessary. The concern also included the possibility that over-reliance on chemical interventions could mask systemic flaws in industrial farming. As a result, the European Union prohibits imports of chlorine-washed poultry, and the United Kingdom kept that same stance after leaving the EU. Trade negotiations with the US often hit deadlock over this very issue, making chlorinated chicken a classic farm practice versus end-of-line sanitation debate. This isn't just about food additives, it's about two fundamentally different philosophies of food safety. Stick around, because we'll look at how that divide over production standards affects trade deals in surprising ways. And this clash over chemical treatments in poultry isn't the only protein battle defining global food regulation. The next example shows how certain growth enhancers used in American livestock prompted more than 160 countries to close their doors. Meat with ractopamine growth drug. In American livestock production, growth efficiency often comes down to feed additives, and one of the most debated is ractopamine. This drug is mixed into feed for pigs and cattle to encourage lean muscle development, helping animals grow quickly while producing cuts of meat that appear leaner on store shelves. For producers, it's been promoted as a way to boost output without increasing feed costs, a method that makes meat look market-ready at a lower expense. Concerns, however, have kept ractopamine out of much of the global food chain. Research has linked the drug to cardiovascular stress, tremors, and altered behavior in animals. Some studies have also raised questions about potential reproductive impacts, with regulators arguing that there isn't enough certainty about long-term effects to justify its use in food animals. Instead of weighing efficiency over safety, many governments have opted to ban the drug outright. As of 2025, ractopamine is prohibited in more than 120 countries, including the European Union, Russia, and China, three of the largest meat consumers and importers in the world. These markets require certification that exported pork or beef is raised without the additive, creating two distinct supply chains. One for American domestic consumption, where ractopamine use remains permitted, and another for export markets that demand drug-free meat. That international refusal has already reshaped trade negotiations, with bans acting as leverage in disputes between the US and its trading partner. For American shoppers, meat containing ractopamine is still widely available, and the practice remains legal under FDA oversight. Abroad, the same products are kept out of stores entirely. The issue illustrates how one additive can determine whether food is accepted globally or shut out at the border. And meat isn't the only case where additives shape whether a product is considered acceptable. Even basic staples like bread can carry chemical aids that foreign regulators no longer tolerate. Bread with potassium bromate. American bread often looks simple. Soft white loaves lined up in supermarket aisles, sandwich buns wrapped in plastic, and rolls stacked in bakery sections. But what gives many mass-market breads their uniform rise and long shelf life isn't just flour and yeast. It's an additive called potassium bromate. Potassium bromate functions as a dough improver. It strengthens gluten, helps bread rise higher, and creates the light, fluffy slices consumers expect to look the same from week to week. For large-scale bakeries, that consistency is valuable. Shoppers don't want surprises when they open a loaf. They want the same texture and volume every time. Potassium bromate helps guarantee that reliability, but with a cost. Scientists flagged problems decades ago. Animal studies showed bromate to be a possible carcinogen, and baking can leave behind trace amounts in finished bread. The health risk, especially when safer alternatives exist, led many regulators to draw a firm line. The European Union, Canada, India, Brazil, China, and South Korea have all banned its use. Their logic is straightforward. Why allow a potential cancer-causing compound when other methods can achieve similar results? In the US, the landscape is shifting but uneven. For years, potassium bromate was widely used in commercial baking. Growing consumer pressure has reduced its presence, and companies increasingly phase it out. At the state level, California went further, banning potassium bromate in 2023 under its Food Safety Act, while also listing it under Proposition 65 as a carcinogen. Other states are considering similar measures, and federal regulators have placed the compound under review. For viewers at home, here's a quick tip. Fresh-baked or artisan breads are far less likely to contain bromate than mass-produced loaves. Checking the label for potassium bromate is the simplest way to know. Bread isn't the only everyday item shaped by chemical shortcuts. The same divide appears in dairy, where production relies on additives other nations have already chosen to reject. Dairy with synthetic hormones. Milk, cheese, and yogurt may feel like some of the most everyday items in American kitchens, but part of that supply is linked to a technology most other countries have already rejected: synthetic growth hormones. Beginning in the 1990s, U.S. dairies were allowed to use recombinant bovine growth hormone, known as RBSD or RBGH, to push cows into producing more milk than they would naturally. The practice was framed as a way to gain efficiency, even though consumer attitudes and regulations abroad went in a very different direction. Outside the United States, regulators concluded the risks weren't worth it. Studies showed that milk from treated cows can have higher levels of a compound called insulin-like growth factor 1, which some research has associated with elevated cancer risk. Added to that were clear animal welfare concerns. Cows treated with RBSD showed higher rates of udder infections and physical stress. For Canadian and European policymakers, the combination of human and animal health doubts was enough to warrant outright bans, both on production and on imports of dairy tied to hormone use. That choice reshaped trade. By the late 1990s, Canada had prohibited RBSD, and the European Union kept the substance off the table entirely. For American exporters, it meant only hormone-free certification could get products through foreign borders. Meanwhile, in U.S. grocery stores, milk from hormone-treated cows remained legal to sell. Over time, though, U.S. consumers pushed back as awareness grew. A USDA survey in 2014 found that only about 9 to 10% of dairies were still using RBSD, and that number has continued shrinking. Today, many national retailers advertise their milk as RBSD-free, while conventional brands still share shelf space beside them. What feels like a choice in American supermarkets, cartons proudly displaying no artificial hormones alongside those without, isn't really a choice abroad. There, hormone-free is the requirement, and it's telling that the same contrast shows up again whenever artificial colors are used to make foods look more appealing than they actually are. Maraschino cherries and neon coloring. Maraschino cherries are meant to be the perfect garnish, a red sphere tossed into a cocktail, perched on top of a sundae, or skewered alongside fruit on a party tray. They look like preserved candy in cherry form, but that bright neon coloring isn't natural. Without help, these cherries would be pale and pinkish. The vivid tone comes from synthetic dyes, most often Red 40. Red 40, also known as Allura Red, continues to draw regulatory attention because of concerns about its effects on children. Studies have linked the dye to possible behavioral changes, such as hyperactivity and attention issues, and some research has indicated allergy risks in sensitive individuals. While U.S. regulators still allow its use, European countries took a firmer stand. Across the EU, products with these dyes must carry warning labels stating they may affect attention and activity in children. Some countries, like Norway and Austria, maintain even tighter restrictions, limiting where dyes such as Red 40 can appear in the food supply. That caution has shaped how maraschino-style cherries are sold overseas. To meet these rules, manufacturers often reformulate with natural alternatives, like extracts from fruits or vegetables, instead of relying on synthetic coloring. The result is a cherry that looks less like a fluorescent prop, but avoids the baggage of warning labels. To the average consumer abroad, the garnish is still there, but without the chemical intensity of the U.S. version. For travelers, here's a tip. Avoid carrying jars of maraschino cherries or cherry-flavored products through customs. Countries with strict dye rules may restrict imports, and many stores abroad don't even stock the neon variety. In the United States, by contrast, they remain a standard fixture of desserts and drinks. And maraschino cherries are just one more example in a long list of everyday foods where American approval clashes with international caution. By 2025, food rules still look very different depending on where you are. The European Union, Canada, and dozens of other countries continue to apply the precautionary principle, banning or placing warnings on ingredients like titanium dioxide, certain synthetic dyes, potassium bromate, ractopamine, and azodicarbonamide. In the United States, by contrast, approvals have generally followed a risk tolerance model based on GRAS standards, though this is starting to shift. The FDA launched new post-market reviews in 2024-2025, and states like California are already passing their own tighter ban. Same shelves, different rules. Decide for yourself which side you trust. And before you go, tell us in the comments which banned item surprised you most. Then hit subscribe for more weird food facts every week.